Nobody moves to North Dakota on purpose. Or at least that's what most of America believes. But a French nobleman once built something here so threatening to the beef industry that Chicago sent men to destroy it. A gunfight broke out on the edge of town. He walked free, and Theodore Roosevelt watched the whole thing from a ranch down the river. And that's barely the beginning. There are forts in this state built directly on top of things the army never knew were underneath. Entire villages pressed into the earth from centuries before anyone in uniform ever set foot here. One woman watched her husband ride out from one of those forts and never saw him come back. She spent the rest of her life making sure the country didn't forget. But somewhere in this state, in a place barely anyone has heard of, something happened that I genuinely thought was a mistake the first time I read it. And when you get to that part of this video, you'll understand why I saved it for last. This is North Dakota, and somehow very few people talk about it. Out west, where the Dakota plains crack open into canyons, the Badlands look like something a tornado tried to draw. Theodore Roosevelt arrived for the first time in 1883 to shoot a buffalo before they all disappeared. Within months, both his mother and his wife died on the same night, and returned to the Badlands not as a hunter, but as a man who needed somewhere to disappear. The ranching life he built here pulled him back from collapse, admitting he never would have become president if it weren't for these broken hills. And now the park named after him exists because the land saved him first. And the buffalo Roosevelt came here to find? Decades earlier, around 30 million of them shook this prairie, but by the 1880s, fewer than 1,000 were left, anywhere on Earth. The herds you see today in the Badlands trace straight back to a desperate rescue. Roosevelt himself helped spark as president. During the rut in late July and August, the bulls become genuinely dangerous. They are charging vehicles, blocking roads, and fighting each other in prolonged clashes that leave the ground torn open and the air thick with dust. The bison here behave differently from herds in more visited parks. This sanctuary receives a fraction of the foot traffic of Yellowstone, and the animals reflect it. They are less habituated to people, more unpredictable, and more likely to move away from roads than toward them. Sprinting at 35 miles per hour and pivoting faster than a horse, they've gored more than a few selfie takers who forgot they aren't standing in front of a petting zoo. Sharing the same buttes and grasslands, you'll find an animal that looks like a cross between a deer and a goat but moves like neither. The pronghorn is the fastest land animal in the Western Hemisphere, hitting 55 miles per hour in a panic sprint. That speed is total overkill, because nothing alive can catch them anymore. They evolved to outrun a North American cheetah that went extinct 10,000 years ago, so basically they're running from a ghost. Their eyeballs, relative to body size, are bigger than any other hoofed animal on the continent. A coyote moving 4 miles away gets spotted instantly. Jumping fences is not happening for them, so crawling underneath is the only way. This is exactly the reason ranchers across the plains have started swapping out the bottom barbed wire for smooth wire. The same ranchers spent the 20th century poisoning the black-tailed prairie dogs by the millions, but they're a keystone of this whole place because at least 130 other species rely on those burrows for shelter. Unlike their white-tailed cousins further west, they remain active year-round, and even when the North Dakota Badlands sit below zero, you'll see them at the burrow entrances. Black-tailed prairie dogs live in tight family groups called coteries, and membership is not casual. Coterie members greet each other with a distinctive open-mouth kiss, reinforcing social bonds dozens of times a day. An animal that isn't recognised gets chased off. Within a town packed with hundreds of individuals, each prairie dog knows exactly who belongs to its family, and exactly who doesn't. Unfortunately, plague moves through their towns periodically and can collapse an entire colony in weeks. We're talking about the same bubonic plague bacterium carried by fleas that has been the single greatest threat to prairie dog populations across the Great Plains since it arrived from Asia in the early 1900s. Luckily, the plague didn't reach Medora, maybe because it's a town founded on April Fool's Day. In 1883, a 24-year-old French nobleman named cracked a champagne bottle over a tent stake and named the spot Medora after his red-haired American wife. Within 3 years, his vision as the man who would industrialise the Northern Plains beef trade collapsed, and he was gone. The town kept his wife's name and forgot almost everything else about him. The catastrophic winter of 1886 to 1887 effectively ended Medora's cattle era in a single season. The temperature dropping and blizzards buried the open range for months, and the cattle died, so the town had gone from a boom town to a ghost town in the space of one winter, and it stayed that way for decades. Its modern identity is almost entirely built on tourism tied to Theodore Roosevelt's legacy, and even if the permanent population sits at around 100 people, it draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each summer. In the wooded creeks and clearings around that revived town, you'll find a bird. Lewis and Clark nearly hunted out of the area entirely. Wild turkeys vanished from this part of the plains for almost a century before being reintroduced in the 1960s. They can run 25 miles per hour and fly 55 in short bursts, fast enough that a lot of first-time hunters have been knocked flat by one exploding out of the snow at face level. Their eyesight is roughly 3 times sharper than ours and covers nearly 300 degrees, which is why sneaking up on them is almost impossible. Males puff up, fan their tails, and gobble loud enough to vibrate windows half a mile away during spring courtship. And here's the thing nobody talks about. These are nothing like the slow, dim-witted creatures most Americans imagine. They remember faces, recognise predators, and warn each other with calls so specific that a male can tell whether the threat is on the ground or in the sky. The turkey rules the woodland edge, but out on the open plain, a different bird puts on a display that makes the turkey strut look modest. Cheyenne is also one of the last strongholds of the greater prairie chicken in the northern Great Plains. Every spring, male prairie chickens gather on traditional booming grounds called leks, the same patches of open ground used by their ancestors for generations. Exactly in the same spots they inflate orange air sacs on their necks, stamp their feet, and produce a deep, resonant booming call that carries across the prairie in the pre-dawn dark. They fan their pointed tails and basically hold a sunrise dance contest to win a mate. Settlers in the 1880s described the prairie chickens darkening the sky, but today the birds are critically rare in North Dakota. Sadly, monoculture farming and pesticides have crashed their populations almost everywhere they used to live. Their cousin, the sharp-tailed grouse, has even better moves. Males rotate in tight circles, stamp their feet on the ground in a blur, and inflate purple air sacs while letting out a strange hollow cooing. A male can stamp so fast in a duel that his feet basically vanish. Females walk calmly through a chaos of spinning, stamping, sparring males and select almost exclusively from that central position. The males on the outer edges display just as hard, and mate almost never. The father plays no role in incubation or raising the chicks. His entire reproductive contribution happens in seconds on the lek, after weeks of pre-dawn displaying. The female then builds a shallow ground nest hidden in dense grass, incubates up to 13 eggs alone, and broods the chicks through their most vulnerable weeks without any assistance. Believe it or not, sharp-tails will roost overnight by burying themselves in soft snow, using it as insulation against 30 below wind chills. Their numbers in North Dakota are healthier than the prairie chickens, but they're still the reason a lot of bird hunters drive 500 miles just to spend a weekend here. "130 miles northeast of the grassland, Jamestown has spent decades making the case that the bison, not the grouse, is North Dakota's defining animal. Believe it or not, this town is the birthplace of the jazz singer Peggy Lee, whose song Fever became one of the smokiest, most imitated vocals in 20th century music. In a state here, the distances between towns are vast enough. Here the population hovers around 15,000, making it one of the larger cities in North Dakota. It sits along Interstate 94, where the famous world's largest buffalo statue, named Dakota Thunder, has loomed over passing travellers since 1959. It was never meant to be subtle because this town wanted something so big, they deliberately planted it on the highest point it had to make sure you'd have to stop the car when you see it. Critics in 1959 complained he looked fat, and the city's response was honest. Real buffalo are fat in winter. The world's largest buffalo has held its title for decades, despite periodic challenges from other communities attempting to build competing statues. A pattern common to American roadside superlatives, where the title itself becomes the attraction. And behind it is one of the most quietly authentic time capsules in the Midwest. Frontier Village is a stitched-together collection of about 24 original North Dakota prairie buildings, trucked in from disappearing towns and reassembled into a single dusty street. What's wild is that every plank in this village came from a real town that died, meaning every wall has a name nobody remembers anymore. It's like an acute graveyard, but a friendly one. Sadly, places like this are becoming rarer every year, as the original buildings rot or get torn down faster than they can be saved. Following tragedy, we reach a low spot in the trees, where two of the most famous explorers in American history nearly froze to death. In the winter of 1804, Lewis and Clark built a small wooden fort here and settled in. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages that surrounded the fort during that winter were among the largest and most sophisticated settlements on the northern plains. They left it 5 months later with maps, a Shoshone interpreter, and the first coherent picture of what lay between the Missouri and the Pacific. The actual fort site is unfortunately gone, washed away by the shifting Missouri River, and the reconstruction is just a few miles from where the real one supposedly stood. Circling above that ground, you'll often spot a bird that means more here than any other in the sky. The golden eagle is sacred to people from these places, meaning that every single feather had to be earned, one act of courage at a time. About 30 active nesting territories are tracked across the Badlands, where these birds raise their young on cliff ledges, with views most humans never get to see. They're hunters that punch way above their weight, because in this state they have taken down pronghorn fawns, full-grown coyotes, and even adult deer. To see one in person is to understand exactly why Plains warriors wanted just one feather. Lewis documented golden eagles in his journals during the Fort Mandan winter. The birds hunting the river bluffs today are the direct descendants of the same population he was watching. Over 2 centuries of American history have passed beneath their nesting ledges, and the eagles have registered none of it. Or maybe they did pay attention on what happened at one of the most important places in American history that almost nobody outside North Dakota has heard of. For 500 years before Lewis and Clark, the Knife River villages were home to thousands of Mandan and Hidatsa farmers. They were people who lived in massive round earth lodges and grew 9 kinds of corn, dozens of beans, squash, sunflowers and tobacco. What's wild is that the lodges weren't built by men, they were owned, designed and built entirely by Hidatsa women who could put one up in about 10 days using cottonwood beams, willow lattice, and packed sod. One Hidatsa woman, born around 1839 and known as Buffalo Bird Woman, eventually shared her grandmother's gardening knowledge with a young anthropologist, and that one conversation became the foundational text on Northern Plains agriculture. Across the prairie, the towns get smaller and quieter, and then they start disappearing altogether. Metigoshe is one of those that didn't quite make it. Founded in 1900, it once had a couple hundred residents, but when the railroad straightened its tracks decades later and bypassed the town, it dried up almost overnight. Only a handful of people live there, and the leaning grain elevator is the tallest thing for miles. What's left is a row of weather-grade buildings and a wind that doesn't bother slowing down. The kind of stories that tell you who lived here, what they fought about, who fell in love behind which barn. Those mostly went to the cemetery with the last full generation. The same interesting stories are what led the US Army to plant its most strategic western outpost at a place called Fort Abraham Lincoln. Sitting where the Heart River meets the Missouri, this was a position the Army chose specifically to control river traffic across the northern plains. It was from here that General Custer rode out in the summer of 1876, while his wife watched from the porch as the column disappeared over the hill, a moment she later described as the last time she saw him alive. She never fully recovered, spending the next 57 years writing and speaking publicly to defend his reputation, long after the Army had moved on. What most visitors don't expect is that the fort sits directly on top of a Mandan village, abandoned over a century earlier, its residents wiped out by a smallpox epidemic that tore through the community in a single season. The outlines of nearly 90 earthen homes are still pressed into the ground today, no excavation needed. When the Army left, those river corridors went quiet, and white-tailed deer moved in, threading through the cover, along the banks just as they do now. They pushed back into this corridor as hunting pressure eased, and the dense cover along the banks gave them exactly the kind of edge habitat they prefer over open ground. Nearly absent from this part of North Dakota a century ago, pushed out by hunting and habitat loss, their comeback since has been so complete, it would have been unrecognisable to early settlers. They survive brutal northern winters not by stockpiling food, but by physically dialing down their metabolism so far that they can go days barely eating and still hold body temperature. A fawn is born nearly scentless, spending its first weeks lying motionless in the grass, relying entirely on that one biological trick to stay invisible to coyotes circling just yards away. When a deer raises its white tail at the sight of danger, it's not just fleeing, it's signalling the direction of the threat to every other deer in range, a system so precise that predators have learned to watch the tails first. Bucks shed and fully regrow their antlers every single year, the fastest growing tissue of any mammal on Earth, capable of adding nearly an inch per day at peak growth. Come November, bucks stop eating almost entirely and can shed close to a quarter of their body weight. They spend those weeks chasing does across the prairie, burning through their reserves before winter even begins. Not far from those same plains, one man spent the last years of his life building something that works on a completely different kind of clock. Mystical Horizons is a working solar calendar made from granite pillars on a prairie hilltop near the Manitoba border, engineered so precisely that sunlight passes through its stone slots only 4 times a year, at the exact moment of each solstice and equinox. It was designed and built by a retired Boeing aerospace engineer who spent his career making aircraft, then came home to North Dakota and dedicated the rest of his life to this. A fixed sighting tube at the site is aligned to the exact latitude of its location, and if you point your eye through it on any clear night, it locks directly onto the North Star. He never saw a single visitor walk through it, because the site only opened to the public after he had already passed away. Less mystical but equally interesting is the fate of Lake Metigoshe. The Ojibwe named it Clearwater Lake surrounded by oak trees, and the Blackfoot, Hidatsa and Assiniboine called it home long before any settler arrived. Early settlers wanted nothing to do with it, too wooded and too uneven to farm, so the first outsiders to stay were Métis trappers who found the land suited them perfectly. Everyone else eventually caught on, and by the late 1800s, families were already hauling camping gear into the Turtle Mountains for the summer, a tradition that has never stopped. That draw toward open terrain and physical challenge eventually will pull toward the unexpected leads to Fargo, a city that looks ordinary from the highway, but has spent decades quietly earning a reputation that has nothing to do with the film. The Red River along its eastern edge flows north, one of the few rivers in the country to do so, which means spring snowmelt backs up instead of draining away, and the city floods with an almost predictable regularity. In 2009, residents had 5 days to lay millions of sandbags before a record crest hit, and they held the line while the water climbed more than 40 feet above normal flood level. The city is now planning a 30-mile diversion channel just to keep the river out permanently, one of the most expensive flood control projects ever attempted by a city this size. Away from the river, a soup called knoofler has quietly outlasted everything. Thick and creamy, packed with dumplings and potatoes, carried over by German settlers who had already moved once from Germany to Russia before landing here. The word simply means button in German, which is roughly what the little dumplings look like. Not a recipe from a cookbook, but one passed down at kitchen tables for generations. Not far west, a different kind of story plays out in Wheelock, a town that once had everything oil money could buy and now has almost nothing left. By its 25th birthday, it had a hotel, a bank, a drugstore, a pool hall, and a lumberyard, the kind of town that looked like it was going somewhere. Then 3 armed men walked into the bank, shot the banker, took all the money, and vanished into the prairie. And the only one ever caught was found dead days later, having left a note that read, "Please excuse me for I am insane." The town never recovered, and by 1994 it had dissolved officially, and when the Bakken oil boom briefly brought workers back, they left again when prices dropped, taking the last of its momentum with them. What Wheelock couldn't hold on to, Standing Rock never lost. Just south, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has kept its language, its ceremonies, and its connection to these plains intact through pressures far greater than any boom or bust. The US Supreme Court itself once described the tribe's land dealings as a more ripe and rank case of dishonourable dealings in the country's entire history, a rare moment of official candour that changed nothing. When a major oil pipeline was proposed, the original route ran near Bismarck and was rerouted after residents there objected to the water risk, placing that same risk directly next to the reservation. The protest that followed drew members of more than 100 tribes, the largest gathering of Native Americans in over a century, and it still didn't stop the pipeline. Through all of it, the Lakota language is still taught to children here, and the sun dance still performed each summer. Not far across the prairie, Arena tells a much simpler story, a small settlement that ran out of reasons to exist and quietly disappeared. It was named for the natural basin ringed by hills it sat in, and the founder thought it looked like one, which turned out to be a more fitting description than he intended. At its peak, it had 150 people, and by the Depression it was down to 35, and when the school closed, the building was sold and physically dragged away to a Mennonite community to be used as a church. The last thing still running was the post office, and it held on until vandals burned it down, and that was that. Over 1,000 towns across North Dakota share a version of that same story, filled fast when the land was cheap, emptied just as fast when it wasn't, leaving nothing behind but foundations and a name on old maps. Fort Union Trading Post, just to the west, takes you back to what came even before the settlers. A fur trade operation so active that the Missouri River itself was its main road. Sitting just 6 miles from Canada, it was one of only 23 radar stations built along the northern perimeter specifically to catch Soviet bombers coming over the poles, because the shortest route from Russia to American cities wasn't across the ocean but over the Arctic. The station ran for over 30 years, scanning hundreds of miles into Canadian airspace around the clock, and in all that time it never intercepted a single threat. When it closed, the government offered the property to anyone who would take it, and federal, state and local governments all said no. Private buyers eventually stepped in, stripped the buildings of anything valuable, and walked away, leaving Divide County to inherit the wreck through a tax foreclosure. Vandals finished what the salvagers started, tearing through every structure until nothing was left standing but the 5-story radar tower, which today holds cell phone antennas, quietly doing a very different kind of watching. Long before any of that, the Missouri corridor was already being fought over, not by governments, but by fur traders willing to travel thousands of miles for one animal. The American beaver was so heavily trapped through that era that it nearly vanished from the continent before the demand finally slowed. Its teeth are reinforced with iron, which is why they're orange, and because they never stop growing, the animal has to gnaw constantly, just to keep them from curving back into its own skull. It has a third eyelid that works like built-in goggles, letting it see clearly underwater while holding its breath for up to 15 minutes. Most people think the flat tail packs mud into dams, but it doesn't. The front paws do that work, while the tail handles steering, balance, fat storage, and slapping the water loud enough to be heard across an entire lake. When winter comes, it seals itself inside its lodge, with the entrance always submerged, meaning any predator that wants in has to swim through freezing water to get there. Not far north, Fortuna Air Force Station watched the sky from the Canadian border for decades, waiting for something that never came. Just 6 miles from Canada, it was one of only 23 radar stations built to catch Soviet bombers coming over the poles, because the shortest path from Russia to American cities wasn't across the ocean, it was over the Arctic. For over 30 years it scanned hundreds of miles into Canadian airspace around the clock, and never once intercepted a threat. Every level of government was offered the property. When it closed and said no, private buyers stripped it bare and walked away, and the county inherited the wreck through a tax foreclosure. Only the 5-story radar tower survived, now holding cell phone antennas, while the coyote picks through the rubble below with the same unhurried confidence it brings to every abandoned place. Of all large predators, it's the one that has actually expanded its range since European settlement, spreading into cities, suburbs, and ghost towns alike, and every organised attempt to remove it has failed. With porcupines, it works in pairs, flipping them onto their backs and attacking the unprotected belly, one of the few animals patient enough to figure that out. On the open prairie, it teams up with the badger, which digs into burrows from above while the coyote covers the exits, and between them, almost nothing escapes. It can hear a mouse under a foot of snow, locate it precisely, and punch through in a single pounce, a move it has to get right the first time, because the sound of a miss carries. Each night, a family group coordinates through a cascade of yips and howls, so layered they can sound like a dozen animals. Appearing numerous costs nothing, and discourages almost everything. What's strange is that even while fleeing, it can't help but look back, a habit that has cost many their lives, but speaks to an animal that stays curious even at a full run. In Sims, coal once brought families together before the industry faded and took the town with it. Coal here was so close to the surface, miners could reach it almost immediately, and when the railroad arrived, it brought workers so fast that boxcars on the prairie served as homes and shops while the town was still being built. Within a year, it had over 1,000 residents. Within 6, most were gone, and when harder coal was found in Montana, the company closed the mine and walked away. The one structure still holding services is the old Lutheran church, whose parsonage became locally famous when the pastor's wife reported seeing a grey shape moving upstairs. The pump handle was also seen rising and falling on its own, and no one who lived there at the time claimed to have an explanation. Out across the same open country, a white wooden church still stands near Hurricane Lake, once the gathering point for Norwegian farming families spread across miles of prairie. The settlement began as a stagecoach stop in the 1880s, never got a railroad, and its post office closed within 2 decades, so most of what it once had was gone before the church finished its first decade of services. Norwegian immigrants built it in 1901, and for years families drove horses and wagons from miles around just to attend. Not only for worship, but because it was often the only reason scattered homesteaders saw each other all week. The congregation eventually disbanded, and the building was locked, though it still stands beside a cemetery holding the names of families whose farms have long since returned to grass. In Gascoyne, on the other hand, the settlement gradually emptied, and most families simply left without any goodbye ceremony, one by one. Originally called Fishbine, the railroad renamed it almost immediately, as if even the founders weren't sure it would last. At its peak, it held the largest stockyard in the county, a school, and a coal mine, none of which were enough to keep the next generation, once the farm depression hit and the automobile made distance irrelevant. Over those same fields, the northern harrier glides low and unhurried. This is a hawk that hunts not by speed but by listening. It tilts its disc-shaped face toward the grass like a living radar dish. Long after the last farms go dark, it stays, gliding at barely rooftop height, hunting the same ground people left behind. That face funnels sound toward its ears, letting it pinpoint a mouse under the grass before it ever sees one, more like an owl than a hawk. Unlike most raptors, it builds its nest directly on the ground, which means every egg it lays is already at the level of the predators it hunts alongside. That same willingness to stay close to the ground is what the International Peace Garden was built on, a place chosen to unite rather than divide. Two nations marked their shared border not with a fence, but with begonias, and during the Great Depression, more than 50,000 people showed up on dusty roads just to watch it happen. At the centre, a stone cairn straddles the line exactly. You can stand on both countries at once, something no passport was ever designed to account for. North Dakota liked the idea so much it put Peace Garden State on every license plate, making it the only US state to define its identity by a single park. Stranger still, the conservatory inside holds one of the world's most varied collections of cacti and endangered succulents, the last thing anyone expects on the Canadian prairie. After September 11th, steel from the collapsed World Trade Center was installed here as a permanent memorial, proof that peace gardens exist precisely because peace never holds itself together. On those same grounds, the Peace Chapel sits open to anyone, just walls cut with words about human dignity, and a door that never locks. Its walls are cut from Manitoba limestone and inscribed with quotes from world leaders, but the two concrete towers that once framed it were quietly demolished after weather erosion made them unsafe, leaving only the words behind. Inside, it stays open to anyone, no denomination required, and most visitors can't tell which country they entered from. Out in the flower beds, monarch butterflies stop to feed on their way through, crossing the same border in both directions without ever noticing it exists. Those same monarchs are on a journey no single butterfly will ever finish, because the full migration from Canada to Mexico takes 4 generations to complete. Each generation flies one leg, lays eggs, and dies, never knowing where it ends. Born in late summer, the final generation makes the entire trip to Mexico without a map, a guide, or any memory of the destination. They arrive every year around Mexico's Day of the Dead, so reliably that local communities have long believed the butterflies carry the souls of the returning deceased. One was once spotted at 11,000 feet, riding air currents like a glider to cover hundreds of miles in a single day. On the ground, their survival depends entirely on milkweed, a plant that has quietly vanished from millions of acres of farmland over the past few decades. Not every prairie stop on their route is still waiting for them, and Sherbrooke is one of them. It was once the county seat of Steele County, handling legal records, county government, and the business of an entire region. Then the railroad bypassed it. The seat moved to Findlay in 1919, and residents didn't just leave. They loaded entire houses onto wagons and hauled them out. Stranger still, the town's hotel once hosted President William McKinley for a single night, a sitting US president sleeping in a place that would eventually have 0 residents. By 1982, 2 people still called it home, and today, no one does. Only fieldstone foundations remain, slowly being swallowed by the surrounding farmland. Scandinavian Heritage Park is no less than that, because here, people were set out to build something worth preserving. It is the only outdoor museum in the world representing all 5 Nordic countries. At its centre stands a 30-foot Dalahorse, a symbol that began as a simple toy carved by Swedish fathers during long winter nights to give their children something to hold. Surrounding it are a 240-year-old Norwegian log house, a stave church replica, a Finnish sauna, and a Danish windmill, all gathered in one prairie city that for nearly 50 years hosted North America's largest Scandinavian festival. That festival ended quietly in 2025 after nearly 5 decades, leaving the park as the one place where everything it celebrated still has a permanent home. Not every place that held on did so with a festival or a landmark, as some towns simply refused to let go through sheer stubbornness alone. Marmarth grew as a rail stop during the Homestead era, giving ranchers and settlers across the Little Missouri Badlands their first real connection to wider markets. The Milwaukee Railroad built it, shaped it, and when it pulled out, took most of the town's reason for existing along with it. What it left behind are aging brick storefronts still standing along the main street, their facades faded, but holding the outline of a town that once had somewhere to be. The railroad depot still stands too, a physical record of the era when a train schedule determined the rhythm of daily life out here. Population has been dropping for decades, yet the people who remain aren't preserving the past so much as simply living in it. On the Château de Morès, we can say a different thing, because the French aristocrat behind it wanted to make sure it will always stand and look the same. He built a 26-room hunting lodge on a bluff overlooking the town below, then set up the first refrigerated beef packing plant in North America, shipping chilled meat east by rail. The idea was so ahead of its time that the Chicago meatpacking industry fought him personally to kill it. He killed a man in a gunfight on the edge of town, stood trial, and walked free, all while Theodore Roosevelt, his neighbour and occasional rival, watched from a ranch just down the river. His father-in-law eventually cut the funding, and the Marquis de Morès left for India and never came back. In Antler, people didn't give up so easily thought. Two miles from the Canadian border, it once had a bank, a customs house and streets full of people, but now counts fewer than 24 residents. In 1911, a tornado tore through and killed 10 people, making it the third deadliest in the state's recorded history, and yet the town rebuilt and kept going. As the population slowly dropped from over 300 to under 30, residents responded not by leaving quietly, but by sewing, building the world's largest quilt, certified by Guinness World Records, as a way of saying the town was still there. Today, only 22 people call it home, with no restaurants, no gas stations and no services, just houses, a grain elevator, and a flag that still goes up every morning. Leith has some things in common, being a settlement so small that most of the world never noticed it existed until it suddenly had to. Most maps barely register it, and for a few years that invisibility almost became something far worse. In 2012, an outsider began quietly buying up land, not to farm it, but to seize enough property to take over the town's government and convert it into a white supremacist enclave. Before anyone understood what was happening, 13 plots had been sold to some of America's most notorious white nationalist figures, and the town found itself in national headlines it never sought. Leith fought back and won, and in a twist the whole story almost deserved. A DNA test revealed the would-be founder of the enclave was 14% black. Long before Leith existed, Fort Buford was built to control the point where the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers meet, one of the most strategic intersections on the northern plains. It is best remembered as the place where Sitting Bull surrendered, but what most accounts leave out is how he did it, handing his rifle to his 5-year-old son, Crowfoot, and having the boy walk it to the commanding officer himself. His words at that moment were direct, telling the officer he wished to be remembered as the last of his tribe to surrender his rifle, then asking who would teach his son to live in the world that had just replaced his own. Not far from where that ceremony took place, a bird stands motionless at the river's edge, wings held open and drying in the wind. The double-crested cormorant is the only diving bird that deliberately keeps its feathers non-waterproof, letting water soak in to cut buoyancy, so it can go deeper and chase fish with less effort. At the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone, the slow, clear river gives it exactly the conditions it needs to track fish visually on the way down. DDT nearly erased it by the 1970s, but the pesticide ban brought it back so fast that the Great Lakes went from 200 nesting pairs to 115,000 in just 30 years. Between dives, it steals sticks from a neighbour's unguarded nest pile, returns to its own, and resumes building as if nothing happened. A single colony can number in the thousands, yet the river below stays unchanged and indifferent to everything nesting above it. That same endurance is what the Prairie churches held on to long after everything around them disappeared. St. Olaf Lutheran Church ran services through -40-degree winters in an uninsulated building, kept alive by a single wood-burning stove. Preaching continued entirely in Norwegian for decades, with some congregations not switching to English, until after World War II. Doctrine split many of these communities from within, as neighbours who crossed an ocean together stopped speaking over theological disputes. They built rival churches on the same road and held the silence for generations. St. Olaf outlasted most of what surrounded it. As farms emptied, families moved on, and the church held its ground long after anyone was left to fill the pews. Not every place that refused to disappear managed to survive, and Omemee had 2 railroad lines, an opera house, a hotel, and its own newspaper. Yet still collapsed so completely that by 1990, only 3 people remained. Sitting at the junction of 2 major railroads, the position every prairie town dreamed of couldn't protect it. Once the lines rerouted, 650 residents were gone within a single generation. Two crumbling buildings and a strip of old pavement are now the only proof it existed. Fort Totten fighted 92 years to survive as we see it today, as the military post that became something far darker than a garrison. It looks like a frontier military post, and it was, but only for 13 of those years. Most of its life was spent as a boarding school, where Dakota children were brought, separated from their families and forbidden from speaking their own language. The English-only rules were so rigid that many Spirit Lake families refused to send their children there at all, preferring a nearby mission instead. Faded murals painted by those schoolchildren still survive on the interior walls, small quiet records left by kids who had no other way to leave a mark. It also briefly housed Dakota children at high risk for tuberculosis, a federal preventorium quietly running inside what had once been a garrison. What those murals recorded in silence, Lander preserved in sound, as Norwegian settlers built a farming community so thoroughly in their own tongue that English was still secondary in church and at the dinner table well into the 20th century. The railroad made it, and the railroad unmade it, as once the lines shifted, the storefronts emptied, and the town stopped growing almost overnight. A few homes still stand beside vacant churches and old service buildings, not restored, not demolished, just holding on. Minot grew where places like Lander couldn't, anchored by a military base and a state fair that pulls tens of thousands every August into the largest annual gathering on the northern plains. The Air Force Base was the one anchor no railroad could cancel, But in 2011, a catastrophic flood put 11,000 homes underwater in a single week, the worst disaster in the state's recorded history. Parts of the city are still physically recovering. Every August, the tone shifts completely as the state fair arrives, and Minot briefly becomes one of the most crowded places in the state, drawing over 300,000 visitors to a city of only 50,000. Livestock shows, rodeo events, concert stages, and local vendors all run simultaneously. Organised chaos that has somehow operated smoothly for well over a century. What's strange is that the same fairgrounds double as winter storage for farm equipment, with the field hosting carnival rides in August, buried under machinery by October. That rural ingenuity is exactly what built the Enchanted Highway, a 32-mile road lined with giant sculptures by a single welder who just wanted drivers to turn off. He funded and built it himself over decades, with no guarantee anyone would ever stop to look. The gamble worked, and those sculptures now pull in enough road trippers and tour buses to keep nearby gas stations and diners from going dark. Around them, real ring-necked pheasants move through the grain fields and roadside ditches, feeding along the edges like they've quietly joined the exhibit. It isn't native to these fields, having come from Asia in the 19th century and taken to the grain stubble so completely that it's now the state bird of South Dakota. Males wear bright collars and long tails that look showy, yet in dry stalks those colours break up their outlines so well that foxes can sprint past without spotting them. Instead of taking off, they usually sprint first, exploding into a run so suddenly that for a moment they look more like startled rabbits than birds. Females do almost all the quiet work, hiding a nest on bare ground, laying a dozen eggs or more, and sitting so still that a tractor can pass within a few feet. When danger comes close, a hen may bolt on purpose, dragging a predator after her and leaving the chicks frozen in place, betting that moving bait is more tempting than a tiny puff of feathers. Young birds memorise safe routes through ditches, fences and crop rows so they can reach gravel roads at dawn to warm up on bare ground. All that scratching along field edges spills grain and stirs up insects, turning the same ditches and fence lines into food for everything from mice to hawks watching from above. This is North Dakota, a land of hidden wonders and remarkable architectural marvels. Now, if you don't want to miss the most unreal wonders of Mississippi Delta. Check out this video.